Flindle with Watery Wishes, and I'm back with another card. Today we'll be using this set from Simon Says Stamp. I think it's called Crafty Friend, and the Sketch Ranunculus set, also from Simon Says Stamp. We'll be using some VersaFine ink, some Watercolor Wishes paper from Lawn Fawn, some black cardstock from Hero Arts, a A2 size card made out of Nina Solar White, 110 pound, some black soot and some wilted violet distress oxide, and some clear embossing powder. Firstly, I'm going to cut the Watercolor Wishes paper down to 3 3/4 by 5.5. That'll give me a bit of matting on the sides of the finished card. Then I'm going to start stamping out and masking the ranunculus flowers from the ranunculus set. I actually have a pre-stamped image off to the side, just done on some copy paper, so I remember exactly where I want to lay everything out. I find that when you're masking, it's best to have a bit of a plan and to have it visually in front of you, and pre-stamping on a piece of scratch paper before you start your actual project is very helpful. Now, when I masked for these images, I only cut out one piece of post-it note, and the project would have been a lot easier had I cut out a mask for both the top and the bottom. And as it was, I ran into some issues with, even though I'd been using the powder tool, my embossing powder was sticking to the areas where I'd previously had the masks. So if I was to do it again, I would definitely cut a second mask for the other side. Actually, I ended up having to do it again because at the end, after I'd put the black Nuvo drops on at the end of the card, after I'd finished the card, I didn't set it aside far enough, and I ended up putting a bit of plastic from a stamp package on top of it and smearing the Nuvo drops everywhere. And because it was for a friend that I was meeting up with the next day, I basically had to redo the front panel. But the second time around, I did cut 2 masks and it went much quicker. As you can see, I'm liberally using my powder tool, and I make sure that if I get any ink on the misty door, that I wipe it off before I stamp. I have had problems before where I've had ink on the door and the ink is transferred to the washi tape on my magnets, and then it's transferred onto my cardstock, and I really didn't want to have to redo this card because I had had ink smeared on it, even though I ended up having to redo it again after I'd completed the card. But the squeegees, the Lawn Fawn squeegee and the, I think Gina K has a tidy towel or something, both of them are invaluable when you're cleaning your stamps. And I know a lot of people use baby wipes, but I find that they leave little fluff bunnies on your stamps, and the next time you go to stamp them, you end up with little bits of inconsistencies in your stamping, or you'll have little clumps of ink where there shouldn't be any because the bits of the baby wipes have adhered themselves to your stamps. So the idea for this card came, the friend that I intended to give this card to, her favourite colours are black and purple. And I had this beautiful watercolour wishes paper, and I felt that I could use it if I used very little water with the Distress Oxides. I could use the watercolour wishes paper as a watercolour underpainting and paint over or in the flowers with the wilted violet and use the black soot for the leaves. This way it created what I think was a lovely two-toned effect with the purples and the blacks. Now, this sort of masking can be a bit tedious, but the results are really worth it. And I'm actually thinking of giving out some more watercolour wishes paper and doing this with other colours, because I really, really like the results of this. So here I'm getting the last masking place for the last stamping, and once I've completed stamping and heat embossing these last two stamps, I will be stamping the sentiment from the Crafty Friends stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I had previously done some stamp surgery on this sentiment because it says sending you a handcrafted hello from very far away, and for most people I would give this card to. I'm not very far away from, so I'll get more use out of the stamp this way. And if I do need to put the bottom of it back there, I just put it on the block or in the MISTI with the bottom piece buttered up to where I cut it off, and it'll stamp like it was never cut. I have to admit, doing this much stamping with the VersaFine ink gave me an extreme dislike for the swinging hinge on the lid of the ink. I found that I kept getting ink on my fingers and it kept getting in the way. And I really feel like it took twice as long to stamp some of the images, just closing that lid every single time. And again, with the liberal use of the powder tool, there's been a couple of times recently I've forgotten to use it when heat embossing, so I've sort of gone to the other extreme where I'm sort of at the moment obsessed with using it and using it liberally. But I suppose it's not a bad habit to have. The beautiful thing about doing that much heat embossing is by the time you get to the last stamp, your heat tool is usually really well warmed up, so the more you do, the less it takes. So here I'm taping my panel to a flexible chopping board because I don't have a wooden board that is small enough to fit on my desk. I do have a huge one that I needed for a university art class, but it's about 3 feet tall, so there's no way it'd fit on my desk. Now here I'm just getting in the base layer of that wilted violet into the buds and the flowers, and even though I'm using a water brush, there is actually no water in the brush. I'm using the water on the plastic, which is, it's like a stiff plastic sheet sitting on top of a piece of watercolor paper, and I'm using the water that I've sprayed on there so that I have more control of the amount of water that I'm using on this paper, simply because it's not watercolor paper, and I wanted to make sure that it didn't peel or tear by the use of using too much water. Now I'm using the black for the leaves. And once I've done one coat for everything, I do go back in and give a second coat to everything. And I paint a little bit looser the second time around. I'm not worried about getting every spot within the leaves. I am worried about staying within the lines, but I wanted to make sure that there was a little bit of differentiation between the second coat and the first coat, and it's really hard to tell on camera, but it did really work out well. Some parts of the wilted violet dried a little bit bluer than others, and it gave quite a nice effect. As you can see, I'm going a lot quicker with the second lot. And I also go in and darken up the black in the leaves. Okay, so now I'm just putting a bit of heat on it to try and dry it a little bit, and it does curl and it does warp, and I fully expected it to. This piece of paper has been subjected to heat, water, and the heat tool numerous times, and it is a piece of patterned paper. Like it's not meant for watercolors, so I expected it to curl up, and I figured I would be using foam tape anyway to prop it up on the matting, so that sort of evens it out a little bit. So now we just get the foam tape on. I struggle with a new roll when they're really big. They're sort of awkward. So now I'm just pulling back some of that backing paper off the foam tape, and see how it makes it easier just to lift back off if you're having difficulty lining it up, because you don't have all that backing away. You can just pull it once you've got it in place. So now I have the Wilted Violet Oxide ink, and I'm stamping another sentiment from the Crafty Friends stamp set, which says "Hugs enclosed." And here are the dreaded Nouveau drops that ended up ruining this card. There are pictures of a card after this, and you'll notice that the Nouveau drops are in different spots, and that's because I had some pre-made in my drawer, and instead of risking another smear because I'd used up the last piece of watercolor wishes paper in that color, I just adhered the pre-made ones to the card. And there we are. That's the completed card. Hope you enjoyed, and don't forget, have fun crafting your imagination. Bye.